Welcome to OnTargetHTML5.com. This is Mike, your host, and in this tutorial we're actually going to be looking at building modals with HTML5 and CSS3. I want to give you guys an idea of what we can do without having to rely and depend on JavaScript to build modals inside of our websites. So for years we've been implementing mobile dialog boxes in our websites. We've always depended upon HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to implement and format those dialog boxes. Modals are very, very popular. They're a great way of relaying information to our users. But we've always had to use JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, a combination of those three technologies, to actually get them in our websites. Many developers are not aware that with the power of some of the new properties in CSS3, we can accomplish the same things without the use of JavaScript. And actually, this is a great feature because there's a lot of advantages to doing it without JavaScript. So that includes the animations. In this tutorial, I'll take you step by step in doing just that. We'll build two different types of modal boxes using nothing but HTML and CSS. So let's go ahead and move into our development environment and view what we're going to be building in this tutorial. I'm going to go ahead and drop out of the presentation and get into my development environment. And actually I have some of the code up here for what we're going to be doing, but our completed project is going to look something like this. I'm just going to build a basic web page. And then I'm going to put a couple of links up here that are actually going to activate our modal boxes. The first one's going to be a standard information modal dialog box. It's going to give information to our users. It's going to have this really cool close feature, which we see on a lot of modals. And the second one is going to be the same type of design, but a different type of box. We're actually going to use a login box for this particular modal. That's going to take a password and a username, and you're going to be able to submit it and actually, obviously with some type of back-end application language like PHP or Net.js or Node.js, you'd actually connect with a database and log into your system. But both these modal boxes are created with nothing other than HTML and CSS. And we actually trigger them with our links. And that's what we're going to walk through, and I'm going to demonstrate in this tutorial how we can actually set these up, all the animations, the modal box themselves, and how we can actually bring them to the forefront using nothing but HTML and CSS. All right, so I'm in the development environment of OnTargetHTML5, and the first thing I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and open up Sublime Text 3. That will be the text editor I'll be using for our demonstrations. And I'm going to go ahead and open up Google Chrome, which I've already got located in my local host inside the modals directory, which I've created for this project. I want to go ahead and create a new folder. And I'm just going to call this folder CSS. And I'm going to create another new folder. And I'm just right-clicking on my directory structure and saying new folder. This one I want to call images, imgs. And I'm going to create a new file. And I'm going to save this file as start.html inside the modals directory. So I'm in the root. And that is going to be my start file. And then I'm going to build my basic boilerplate template for HTML5. And that's going to give me my doc type, my language, my heading, just the basic things that we use for each document. And I'm going to go ahead and save the changes to that file. And again, if you saw me do that rather quickly, I'm actually using the Emmet plugin for Sublime Text. You'll see me doing that a lot throughout this tutorial series. It just saves a lot of time on typing, but I'll always make certain to pause long enough to let you catch up. If you don't have Emmet with your text editor, if you don't have, I would recommend downloading, though. It is an excellent way to save time as you're working through the tutorials. Great opportunity for you to pause, to catch up with our code, because we're going to get right in now to building our modal boxes. So modal boxes on your website are a tool that's frequently used as we develop our web pages. They can be used for login forms, registration forms, advertisements, notifications to our users, information on the site, information to the user, and a variety of other very useful purposes inside of our web pages. They can relay useful information to our site users and can be set up in such a way as to be non-intrusive as our users navigate the site. That's one of the reasons why I really like modals. If they're used right, they're very non-intrusive. I mean, they can actually be brought up by the user, or they can actually be triggered as you scroll. They can be triggered as they select a particular button. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that you can bring these in. Despite the fact on how useful they can be, many web developers fail to realize that the modal windows can be created without the use of JavaScript. In fact, using JavaScript to create these UIs does not sit well with best practices, as when created with JavaScript, they do not follow progressive enhancement or graceful degradation practices that we're supposed to be following now with all these new standards. Most do not realize that all we need to do to create very functional modal windows are CSS and HTML. Those are the only two real technologies that we need to do this. This does not need to be an issue with your site, as HTML5 and CSS3 allow us to create some very functional modal windows using just those two technologies. So let's demonstrate how we can create a couple very useful modal windows using nothing but CSS3 and HTML5. And the first step is to actually create our markup, our HTML5 markup. So what I want to do before I actually mark up the page, and again, I want to remind you, I'm actually using Sublime Text 3 as my text editor. You can use whatever editor you like. I'm actually using the Emmet installation pack, so it gives me a lot of shortcuts when I'm entering the code. I'll be using those, but I'll make certain to pause long enough if you don't have that and you want to type the code in, which I'm sure you'll do if you want to follow along. And I actually do have my web server up and running. I'm actually in a modals directory that I created on the web server where I'm actually going to store my files for the demonstration and so that I can show you what's going on. First thing I want to do is I want to add a link to the style sheet in my head section of the document. So I'm just going to type link, hit my tab key, and then I'm going to give it the path, and it's going to be CSS/styles.css. I'm going to go ahead and save that change. Now I actually need to go create the file because we actually don't have a CSS file yet. So I'm going under File, I'm going to say New File. I'm going to do a Save As, and I'm going to save this inside the CSS directory as styles.css. And then I'm going to save that into that CSS directory. So we should now have that style sheet in there, which we do. And I've also got a couple images I'll be using inside my images folder for the demonstration. I actually have a background image I'm going to use, and I've got a travel image I'm going to use for one of the modal windows, just to show you how you can actually put images as part of these modals. All right, so getting back into that HTML document. First thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and put in a container that's going to store, or it's going to contain everything that's inside the body element of my document. So I'm going to give that a class of container, and I'm going to have my opening and closing div tags. And again, if you're not used to seeing Emmet in action, that dot, when I enter the dot in the container name or the class name, once I hit the tab key, it actually gives me the div. It knows that by putting the dot with the class name in there, I want a div and I want it to have a class of container. Inside the container, I'm going to add a heading. It's going to be an H1 heading. And inside my H1, I'm going to say a demonstration of modal windows. And I'm going to go ahead and save those changes. Let me go ahead and scroll. That's good. You can actually pause if you want to catch up and get that in. Remember, we've got a div now with a class of container and an H1 inside of our div with a demonstration of modal windows. If I were to refresh the browser, I'm going to see my start page. I'm going to go ahead and load that up, and you'll see that we just got that H1 inside the browser window. So now I'm going to add a link to trigger our modal once we create it. So there are many ways that we can trigger modal windows. I'll be using a standard link so as to stay away from JavaScript. But we can actually trigger windows based on a page location, a user action, scrolling of a page change. There's a whole bunch of different ways that we can actually trigger modal windows inside of our websites. And I may actually do another tutorial on those once I get this one all wrapped up. But underneath my H1, I want to create a UL. And inside the UL, I am going to put an LI. And that LI is going to have an A tag in it. And that A tag is going to have an ID, or it's going to be referencing an ID of first modal. This is important because this is actually the ID we're going to give that first modal. And that's how this anchor tag is going to know what to target when we actually want to open that modal window. And inside the anchor tag itself, I'm going to say open modal 1. Go ahead and fix that P. And again, this name is important. This ID name is important. We're using the hash symbol or that number sign with first modal to identify the ID we're going to be targeting. And actually, we call this a hash and a number symbol, but it's actually called an octathorpe for anyone that's really interested. All right, let's go ahead and save those changes. We'll be coming back to this in a later exercise. I'm actually going to add an additional link to this UL because we're actually going to trigger the second modal that we create also through here. But now we've got our basic configuration set up for our HTML. Now we're actually going to go start building that first modal box. All right, so right under the UL, and actually I'm going to actually put a comment in here, modal number 1. And that should be an A, not an E. not model, modal. Let me go ahead and make that a comment. And then right under there, I want to open up a div. So I'm going to have a div with a class of first modal. Actually, I'm going to give it an ID of first modal. So I'm going to say ID of first modal. And I want to have a class of Modal Dialog. So you'll notice now we set up that div with an ID of first modal, and this matches that href. This is what we're actually referencing now when we hit that link, and I'm giving it a class of Modal Dialog because we're actually going to set up that class in our CSS and do some styling with it. Let me go ahead and save that change. Good time to pause if you need to get that in. Now we're actually going to go ahead and build the entire modal box itself inside this div. When constructing modals on your site, it's always a best practice to keep the Modal Dialog Box code at the end of your HTML structure. So I'd have all my page count up in here, my nav sections, my sidebars, whatever, my sections, and then at the very bottom of the page, just before the closing body element, and just above where we call any JavaScript, we're calling at the end of the body section, we'd actually put these modals. All right, so I'm going to come inside that Modal Dialog, and I am going to create a div. Give a few lines blank space in there. Let's go ahead and pull this out. I actually do want to put a comment here that this is the end or closing of that modal div. And the reason I do that, for anyone that's done any of my tutorials, it just makes it a lot easier as the pages get more complex. It makes it much simpler for me keeping track of what is where. Because a lot of times we're going to have a lot of divs stacked on top of one another, closing divs. It just makes it easier to keep track of things. Inside the div, I want to create a head section or a header section. I'm going to copy this so you don't have to watch me type it. But right inside that div, I am going to create a header for my modal itself. Let me go ahead and clean up my formatting. It's going to have a tag, an href anchor tag with the title of close. And I'm going to have a close ID. And I'm going to set up a class of close. And we're actually going to set this up in our CSS. This will be our close button. And I'm going to have an H2 inside the header called my first modal box. This could be whatever title you wanted it to be, but it's going to be our first modal box. Then right below that, I'm going to open up another div with a class of modal body. And again, I'm going to copy this so you don't have to watch me type all this. But I'm going to come right below my header, and I'll open up another div with a class of modal body. And that modal body is going to go to the very end of my content section. So I'm going to put that right there, because inside the modal body, I'm actually going to put an HR for a horizontal rule. I'm going to go ahead and bring this back. After my horizontal rule, I'm just going to have a couple paragraphs of text. So I'm going to come right under my horizontal rule, put in a couple paragraphs of text. And this, again, this text could be whatever you wanted it to be. I'm just using some standard text just so we have some filler text for inside the modal body itself. After my filler, I'm actually going to close out my div. And actually, I think this was the closing modal body div right there, because now I'm going to actually put a footer in. So I'm going to put another HR below that for another horizontal rule. I can pull that div out. And then I'm going to go ahead and add my footer inside the modal body, or inside the modal itself, I should say, not the modal body. And that's going to have a footer. And again, putting in a tag, an anchor tag with a link to modal link for more information. Then I'm just going to go ahead and pull out all this blank space. And again, that was just my div enclosure. I'm going to go ahead and save all those changes. So what we've added, not a save as, save all. What we've added is this entire modal, which is the content of the entire modal for this particular demonstration. Let me go ahead and put a close or a comment on this tag too. This is my closing container tag, just so again we don't get confused as we're working through here. Closing container div. Go ahead and save all those changes. This is a great time for you to pause if you want to get that first modal in that we just created. Let me go ahead and scroll up just a tad so you can see the links in the event you didn't get those. And we've actually created now the entire first modal. I'm going to go ahead and refresh the browser window, and you'll see now that we actually got this content inside of our web browser. It doesn't look anything like a modal yet, but trust me, we're getting there. because now what we're going to do is we're going to go in and start adding our CSS to this content. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're actually going to start styling the content that we just added to that HTML document. So we have the structure for our first modal itself. Now let's start adding our styles. Remember that we created a style sheet inside our CSS folder called styles.css. We actually have that blank file right there. So let's go start adding some content to it. First thing I'm going to do is I do with all my style sheets, the very first line I always put a comment in there as to what the style sheet pertains to, and usually the date, the author, and what version it is. And again, I'm just going to put in that generic comment for you. It's just a good practice to get into as you're starting to build your own pages, to actually version control your style sheets and put dates in them. And actually I comment them pretty well too as I start building larger sites, so it's easier to find things. First thing I want to style is the HTML element itself. So I'm going to come into my style sheet and I'm going to address the HTML element. I'm going to give it a background image, URL. I'm going to go up into my images directory and use the code_35.jpg. And that is one of the images in my image directory. It's going to actually give us a background, and the 35 is the transparency I have set on that particular image. After that, I'm going to say background repeat. Now repeat, I'm going to position it in the top left-hand corner. I want it to cover the entire browser window or the viewport, and I want it to be a height of 100%. So whatever viewport we have, it's going to stretch to maintain that height. After that, I actually want to address the container that we put everything in. And that's that div with the classic container that I created. I'm going to come right down below the HTML element. I'm going to address my container class. And again, I'm going to address the container with a width of 90%. I'm going to give it a margin top and bottom of 0 and auto left and right to center the container inside my browser viewport. I'm going to go ahead and save all those changes. Great time to pause if you need to catch up and get those put in. I'm going to go in and refresh my browser window. Now you'll see we actually have the background, and we're actually starting to see some of the styling come into play now for the modal itself. We actually can see our container is taking up 90% of the viewport, and things are working, or should be working and responsive as we have set them up to be. All right, now let's go ahead and address the H1 element. And again, I want to put my H1 text line in the center, so I'm just going to come right below the container, and I'm going to center align that H1. Then I'm going to set up my UL. Remember, the UL is where we actually set up the links to actually trigger our modal. So I'm going to say UL list style type none. I'm going to give it a background color of 245, 245, 245 with a 0.9 alpha or transparency setting. It's going to give us kind of a white background for the UL. Display is going to be an inline block, and the width is 50% of its parent element. Right after we set up the UL, I want to work on my LIs. So I'm going to come right down below the UL. I'm going to set up my LI with a padding of 5 pixels top, 0 pixels right, 5 pixels bottom, 15 pixels left. And now we're just positioning the actual link that we're set up inside of that UL. Give it a font size of 1.2M. And actually this should be rem. We should start getting used to using rem now because it references the root. And that is becoming the new standard for sizing, is using rems instead of Ms or pixels, especially for mobile responsiveness. And then I'm going to actually go in and address that A tag that's inside my list element. So I'm going to come down right below that, and I'm going to say link with a child element of alpha, or the A tag, the anchor tag. Give it a color of 333, which is a dark gray, and text decoration none. I'm going to save all those changes. Let me go ahead and scroll just a tad. Make sure that you can get everything we just put in from the H1 down. Good time to pause if you need to type those in. I'm going to make sure all my changes are saved. I'm going to go into my browser, refresh my browser window. Now we can see that we're actually starting to style that link that we're going to be using to actually trigger our modal device. Last thing I want to do, for right now at least, is to set up the horizontal lines, because I'm actually going to configure, we actually have a couple of horizontal lines that we're using inside of our demonstration. And I'm actually going to style these. Most people don't realize that you can style those horizontal rules just like you can style any other element in HTML. And I've actually got some pretty cool styles that I've set up for mine. I've been styling mine for quite some time on the websites I do for my customers. So I'm going to come in and say horizontal rule element, your border is 0. I want you to have height of 1 pixel. And then in your background image, let me go ahead and set up my word wrap. Then in your background image, I want you to set up a linear gradient to the right, and it's an RGBA. And it's all zeros, RGBA, so we know that all zeros is going to give us a black color. with a 0 transparency. And I'm going to do the same thing, 0.75, and then again RGBA with a 0 transparency. So what we're doing is we're actually fading this line out as it works its way out from the center. I'm going to save all those changes. Good time to pause if you need to get that put in. I'm going to go and refresh my browser window. And now you'll see we've got these nice horizontal rules. These are going to become part of the modal window itself. But we have these nice horizontal rules that are dark in the center and kind of fade off as they move out from the center on both sides. So it's kind of cool. I actually like it. I've been styling my horizontal rules for quite some time. I got about 20 or 30 different styles that I use depending upon the site. That's one of the styles I like for modals. All right, so now we can actually go in and let's start styling the modal itself. All right, so now it gets kind of cool because now we're actually going to start. We've been styling the HTML, the cosmetics of it, to give us a site page. Now we're actually going to start styling that first modal. I'm actually going to put a comment in here, first modal styling. And again, I tend to do this with most of my style sheets where I break them up into sections so it's easier for me to find things. So inside that first modal styling, the first thing I want to do is I want to address this modal dialog that we set up with that div when we first created the modal. And it's going to have quite a few styles in it. So I'm going to come in here right below my first modal styling. I am going to address the class of Modal Dialog. I am going to give it a position of fixed. I'm going to give it a font family of Arial, Helvetica, Sans Serif. And again, you can use whatever ones you want to use. I'm going to position this in the top right, or top 0, right 0, bottom 0, left 0. So technically, starting out, this modal is invisible. It can't be seen. The background color is going to be a pure white, or I'm sorry, a pure black with 0.85 transparency. My Z-index is going to be 99999, so I'm making certain that it's completely gone. The opacity is 0. My transition, now when we actually call this in, and this is one of the beauties of CSS3, I'm going to take the opacity, I'm going to transition it over 500 milliseconds, that's a half a second. It's going to ease it in, and the pointer events are none. And then what I want to do is I want to set up my Modal Dialog Target pseudo class. So I'm going to come right below that, or pseudo element. I'm going to say Modal Dialog opacity 1. So when it becomes a target, it's going to be given an opacity 1, so it's going to become visible. And the pointer events are auto. Let's go ahead and save all those changes. Great time to pause if you need to catch up to get those put in. I'm going to go and refresh our browser window because we can actually see now that the modal dialog is gone from our display. Based on the settings we just put, we've actually started to style the dialog box itself, but we've made it invisible because we haven't selected it. I probably could select it and get it to kind of fade in, but it doesn't look very good. And we don't have a close feature yet, so that's not a good idea. So now let's go in and actually add some additional styling. Now I want to address this div that we set up inside the modal dialog. Remember this blank div? I didn't give it a class. I just put a blank closing div in there, or a blank div. So I'm going to say modal dialog with the child of div. I am going to go into my styles.css and right down below my modal dialog target, I'm going to say modal dialog with the child of div. I want your width to be 400 pixels, your height to be 250 pixels, your position is going to be relative to your parent, your margin is 10% top and bottom, auto left and right, padding is 5 pixels top, 20 pixels right, 13 pixels bottom, 20 pixels left. And I actually played with these settings just to get this dialog box to look the way I wanted. You'll probably do the same thing as you play with yours. Depending upon your content, you're probably going to adjust the width, the height, not so much the position, but you're going to play around with the margins and the padding. I gave it a border radius of 10 pixels because I want rounded edges, and my background color is going to be white. I'm going to save all those changes. I'm going to come down, and now I actually want to address the close button, because we actually have a close class inside of our modal. If you remember right, we actually set up a close class right here for that X that we put in there. So let's go set that up in our styling. And I'm going to say my class of close is going to have a background color 606061. That's kind of a light blue. The color itself is going to be white. That's the color of the actual X that's actually inside that background close feature. I'm giving it a line height of 25 pixels. Its position is absolute, and I'm positioning it negative 12 pixels from the right. Text align is centered and negative 10 pixels from the top. So what I'm doing is I'm actually moving that kind of outside the upper right hand corner of that modal box, and you'll see it when we bring it up. I've given it a width of 24 pixels. Text decoration is none. My font weight is 800 because I want that closed X to be a relatively large, bright X. Border radius is 12 pixels. And again, because I've used a 12 pixel border radius with a width of 24 pixels, we're actually creating a circle. And then my box shadow, because again, the circle's 12 pixels is half of 24. So if I wanted to make this bigger, obviously I'd increase my line height, increase my width, and whatever my width was, I'd divide by 2 and make that my border radius to make it a circle. And then I'm giving it a box shadow of 2 pixels, X, 2 pixels, Y, 3 pixels blur, with a color of #000, which is black. Let's go ahead and save all those changes. I'm going to scroll up just a tad. Good time to pause if you need to get those last 2 items that we put in. I'm going to go into my browser. Let's go ahead and refresh the browser window, and you can see that our first modal now is starting to take effect. I mean, we're actually starting to see how this modal is going to look inside of our browser window. We're not quite done yet, but we're getting there. All right, so let's go ahead and put in the final CSS that we're going to use for this particular modal. I'm going to go ahead and close that modal out. Let's go back into our CSS file because I actually want to add a hover effect to that closed class. So I'm going to come down right below the closed class, and I'm going to give the closed class a hover effect and change the background color to this nice light blue. And then I actually want to add a footer, or I'm sorry, not add a footer, but style the footer that we put inside the modal. Because remember, we actually added a footer to this modal right here. So let's style that. And I'm going to say my color is going to be 0C0. Padding is 5 pixels top and bottom, 0 left and right. Text decoration is none. And I want this to float right because I want this message box to be floated all the way to the right side of the footer. And that's going to be for more information. Let's go ahead and save all those changes. Another good time to pause if you want to get those put in. I'm going to go ahead and refresh the browser window. And now we should have a fully functional modal for the first modal that we created. And you can see we got a nice blue close button. You see why I put the positioning -10, -12? It actually takes it outside the corner. You can actually see where we have the border radius on the modal box itself. The round close button, because remember what I told you here with the width, half the border radius is the border radius is half the width. That actually gives us that round feature. And again, I can use that to close it out. Go back into my page. If I hit the link, it reopens the modal. This could be whatever text you wanted. This is for more information. That's the one I floated to the right in the footer. So there's a lot of cool things that you can do with these modals, these HTML5 and CSS3 modals inside your web pages. We're going to go do another demonstration because I actually want to show you one that I set up as a login form as another demonstration.